You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Signe Pike on the show with me today. She has an amazing new novel. It's called The Forgotten Kingdom. It's the second book in the Lost Queen series, and I know you guys are absolutely going to love this book. Welcome to the show, Signe.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. Signe, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Ooh, that's a great question. I remember one of the first writing projects I ever did was sitting on my parents' back deck when I was probably in second or third grade and writing this god-awful poem. And I swear to you, the title was The Elves of the Merrylands.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was horrible. I mean, this was some real dog roll, but I was out in nature, and I think there was something about that yard, and I felt connected to it, and it rhymed, and it just that was it. And then as I was growing up, I always wanted to be a journalist for National Geographic. I thought that would be the best way to tie together my love of animals and nature and my love of writing. But my career had a different idea, my career track. So I applied for magazine jobs, never got them. But I did get a job working as an assistant in the book business. And I think that's what really, put me where I am today.
Oh, where did you grow up, Signe?
I grew up in Western New York State in a little town called Ithaca, New York. It's most famous for Cornell University and Ithaca
Sure.
College. You're there. Yeah, Ithaca is gorgeous. We've got tons of beautiful waterfalls. It's right in the Finger Lakes. Basically heaven on earth.
I love it. So you always knew that stories were going to be a big part of your life. And when you went to work in the publishing industry, did you feel like that was going to scratch that itch, or was this a stopgap measure on your way to being novelist Signe Pike?
Oh gosh, no, I never imagined I would write. I felt like I had really found my niche in that I love to read so much. And I remember my first internship I got, and I sat there thinking, I can't believe that you could get paid to read for a living. And one of the assistants who was actually hired there, it was at Farrar Straus Giroux, which is such an amazing publishing company, one of the oldest in the country, said, well, it's not really that you get paid so much, because the salary, I think.
But all the books you can read.
All the books you can read, but you have to be really, really into making yourself some ramen at night, and you learn all the little New York City survival tricks. But I loved editorial, and that was actually the career that I really saw myself being a career editor and coming up the ranks and a lifer, really. And so I was actually kind of surprised when my dad passed away, and I think it was more that I fell out of love with New York City and my existence there, and I just couldn't continue living life in the same way anymore. And that's when I really decided I need to make a change.
So Signe, as someone who has worked in the publishing industry, you know all of the ins and outs and what it takes to bring a book to market and all of that stuff. But I love to ask people, when you were a kid, do you remember what the first book that you read, maybe as a series, maybe as an author that gave you this feeling that made you realize that books could completely transport you to another place? And along with that, do you remember when you realized that books were made by people and, didn't just appear out of the ether. And if they were made by people, then maybe they could be made by people like you. Do you remember that realization?
Well, that realization didn't come until much later, but certainly there were 3 books that as a young child really stuck out to me. And my father read us when we were quite young, The Old Man and the Sea. And hearing that book Hemingway read with his voice, my father had this really deep, rumbly voice, and hearing him read those lines, my sister and I were just transfixed. And we went on, I think he read us Old Man and the Sea before he read Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, but those are the other two. He read us The Hobbit. And of course, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And those were really, I think it was those books that opened this rabbit hole for me. And then I read all of Madeleine L'Engle, and that was really all I wanted to do was curl up under my sister's desk on a rainy day with like a jar of pickles and sit and read.
That's such an odd progression, because most people start with fantasy and then would go to The Old Man and the Sea and then maybe come back around to fantasy. It's so funny that you started there and then your progression went to weirder tales. That's odd and fascinating. It
speaks a lot to the man my father was, because he was obsessed with literature, and so I think he wanted to make sure we got some of the Hemingway in before we shifted gears to the more fantastical. He was kind of an amazing guy, and he could recite Chaucer in Old English or Beowulf in Old English and Chaucer in Middle English. He was just a magnificent guy.
That is fascinating. So do you remember, you said that he introduced you to Tolkien and then to Lewis and all of these great stories. Do you remember that first fantasy that made you feel like you could leave this world and go to another one?
It was definitely The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I remember one of the things we used to do is we used to take that book on walks out by the waterfalls, and we would sit on a log in autumn with apples for snacks after school. It was our way of exercising the dogs, really, but we would go out and sit on a log in the middle of the woods and read. And to read a book like that while you're sitting in this magical world, it felt like the two were one and the same. It felt like I was in a version of Narnia as my dad was reading me these lines. So that was really a transcendent experience to have as a young girl.
I'll bet. So you wind up in publishing and you're working on the editorial side. You mentioned your father's death and how that moment that experience was really an awakening for you and led you out of the city. What was going on professionally for you during that time when you started to get disillusioned with the city and your sight started changing? Kind of what was going on besides your father's passing that kind of stoked those transitions?
Well, I think professionally things were fantastic. I was starting to get more freedom to buy the kinds of books as an acquisitions editor that I really wanted to share with readers. I was getting sent some really amazing projects by some really fantastic agents. And so I was really excited about work. But one thing I noticed was that I felt completely drowned in it. I write in my memoir that I published Fairy Tale when I left New York and went on this whole journey to search for enchantment in the outside world. It was just this always carrying home these heavy manuscripts. This was back in the day when we were just transitioning as editors to editing on computer. And there were still are today editors who just never made that transition, which I think is amazing. I learned how to edit on paper with a pen or pencil. And then I had to transition to learn on a computer. But we still were carrying, 500 pages of paper home with us to read, just submissions from agents and projects that we had to edit. And everything was done when you got home there was no time at the desk to sit and edit. That was when you're working on producing the books that are already in the pipeline. So it was just a constant level of work, and I didn't have the emotional energy to keep up with it. And I just started to feel like I was drowning in it. And it was really sad. It was gutting to leave that industry, because I left behind some authors that, I purchased the books. They went on to become New York Times bestsellers.
Oh, wow.
That I'd bought, and I wasn't even there to celebrate that with these writers I've been working with. So that was hard. But I definitely found that it wasn't really a choice. I was just too drained, and I was too disillusioned to be able to stay any longer.
Well, speaking of that, there's been a lot of changes in the publishing industry over the last, decade or so. And, Kindles were some of that first change that we started happening. And, there's lots of things with the economy and lots of changes in publishing. Did you foresee some of these changes coming along, and could you see the tides turning? And, publishing is kind of one of those old industries that technology is kind of slow to come to. And, could you see the writing on the wall for some of the turmoil that publishing would go through?
I would say probably more related. I would say you could spot the turmoil much more in relation to some of the more the social and civil rights types of issues that are going on now, because it was such an old guard type of business. Because to me, that wasn't so much about the fact that publishers weren't recruiting diversity. There was diversity at Random House when I was there, and they actively were searching for the best candidates, no matter what their skin color was. But it was just that this was the pool of people who really geeked out about books, and they happened to be from a more homogeneous background. And so that was kind of, but there wasn't a lot of room for new ideas and new information to come in. And I think that that's something that publishers have been working really, really hard to course correct, even before we had these big disasters that started happening with my friend Janine Cummins' book, and things like that. But as far as the technological era, one of the things that I love about publishing is that it, in a way, to me, I think it's bulletproof. I remember people talking about how when I was back in Random House, probably 2004, 2005, and that was when indie bookstores were really struggling. That was the rise of Barnes and Noble and all of these other big, box stores. You've Got Mail came out before that with, Fox Books,
yeah.
that world. But look at today how indies are thriving. I read in the Times last week that book sales in the US are up by 12% just this last year. I think people.
That's amazing.
Yeah, isn't it incredible? And I feel like people need stories now more than ever. I never really had a doubt or worries that anything was going to befall the publishing industry. I think it can weather changes. And I think that what matters is that everybody who's working in publishing loves stories, and you have to put up with the level of work and the grit that it takes to really survive in that profession. And so it's like film and TV, where it's built out of people who love artists, and kind of many editors, we wish we were artists, but maybe we stand in the sidelines and we try to help other people shine, because that's how passionate you are about the written word. So I never really have any doubts. I mean, I think that storytelling is as old as those cave paintings on the walls in France, and it's just not going anywhere. We may shift our mediums. Sometimes ebooks are more popular, but one thing I've noticed just in my own reading habits is that with COVID, I want a juicy, thick, giant, chunky book that I can turn the pages, that
Yes.
I bring onto the hammock as I run the bubble maker for my child and dog, so I can have 5 minutes to just, sink into a book. And that's what I want. And I think it's the same. I've never bought more physical books in this past year than I have. And I've heard the same from all of my friends.
Noveler is the best way to write a novel. Why? Quite simply because we've made it the easiest place to do it. Writing a novel is hard enough. Noveler takes care of all the logistical bits of writing a novel, just leaving that small matter of the words to you. It's a clean, beautiful writing interface with writing analytics, goals and streaks, advanced grammar checking, version control, day, evening, and night modes, and many other features designed to take all the stress out of writing. Tell us what you need and we'll build it. Together, we'll build a better tool. With a design-led approach, all the right tools that you need, Noveler saves all your words constantly, allows you to manage and order your novel easily. It's accessible from any device, desktop or mobile. It syncs to Google Drive and Dropbox. It allows exports in various formats, including ebook and more. It also has nice touches like allowing you to write both offline and online, unique for a web-based platform. Everyone needs help with their writing, from inspiration through to grammar checking, so we're doing our best to provide that support. We integrate that support directly into Noveler. Our advanced grammar checker powered by Pro Writing Aid does everything from spell check to style advice. Our writing courses include the incredible Tim Clare's Couch to ADK. We're really excited to offer all Author Stories listeners 30% off Noveler for a whole year. And it doesn't matter if you choose to sign up for the monthly or annual plan. You'll get 30% off. All you need to do is use the discount code HANK when you sign up. Noveler, Novlr. That's noveler.org.
I agree with you. You know, there have been technological trends that have come along. You know, the advent of YouTube and Netflix and all of that, and you know, you hear the horror stories. Well, this is going to be the killer of the book industry, and no, these things kind of wax and wane, but we all come back to stories, and because, you know, without great storytelling, you don't get any of that stuff. So yeah, I think people just need to kind of calm down, and books are going to be okay.
I think so too. And you know what's really interesting is that when you look at, I think maybe growing up in the editorial side of things and seeing a lot of television and film options, you realize just how much that world relies upon books.
Oh, yeah.
Storytelling. I mean, probably, I don't know, just a guess, but I'd say 30% of the Netflix hits are based on some kind of book. So
yeah, I think that would be a fair assessment as well. You mentioned earlier fairy tale, your book, One Woman's Search for Enchantment in a Modern World. I don't feel like that we get to the Forgotten Kingdom without having had fairy tale and that first book that you wrote. What was what drove you to write that book, and do you see a connection from where you are now and going through this book?
Absolutely. You know, my writing has changed a lot because I wrote that book in 2009. It's now 2020. So I've done a lot more writing over the years, and I think my voice has matured a bit. But that story was a moment in my life where, you know, I was so disillusioned and trying to find a sense of enchantment, but as a skeptic. And it's interesting to me how that book began as a search for fairies and other adults who maybe still believed in fairies, because I thought that was such a ridiculous thought. And I wanted to understand where these people came from. And I became really intrigued about hearing about their encounters, because when you ask people who have had some sort of strange encounter in nature, it's not unlike hearing someone talk to you and tell you a ghost story. It's very, very similar and just as absorbing. And there are accounts of people going back into the 17 and 1800s, especially as you go over to the United Kingdom and Ireland, people who have had these really strange experiences out of doors that they can't quite explain. And so that's what I became really interested in. And then when I traced that book all the way down to the roots, and I went on the journey, and I went over to Scotland and England and Isle of Man and even Mexico, researching indigenous belief in nature spirits, what I found was that in Ireland and in Scotland and in parts of England, that belief actually came from the Celts. And you know, I hope this isn't a spoiler. Maybe this will help people be more open to reading the book who might think, well, it's awfully silly to quit your job and go off and search for fairies. Um, but what I discovered in the end was that really what the belief in fairies is, it is a folk memory of the pre-Christian gods of the Celts. And that's what got me interested in Celtic research. And I think if I hadn't started on that journey, I would never have, you're right, I never would have gotten into the world of the Lost Queen. But they're so similar in the way of that they examine this idea of everyday enchantment. Nature spirits, or whatever you want to call it, there's sometimes a presence when you stand in front of this amazing waterfall or you sit by an old tree. People feel that. That's what people are trying to give voice to when they talk about nature worship or nature spirits. It's that feeling of oneness and presence that you get from sitting in the natural world. And that was something that the Celts lived every day. To me, that's not magic, and it's not otherworldly. It's not supernatural. It's incredibly natural. And so I think with my work and even what I do in The Lost Queen and The Forgotten Kingdom is I'm trying to show the side of Celtic religion, that isn't fantasy, but it's the way that the ancient mind worked. And in that way, that's why my books are actually classified as historical fiction. They're not really classified as fantasy.
So in 21st century America, where you and I are talking, even though we have a kind of a worldwide audience, but coming from the perspective of you and I, when you first start talking about the Celtic religion and the ancient beliefs of the people of England and Scotland and Ireland, that is a foreign concept to a lot of us. We don't understand, even though a lot of us are descended from those places and from family that hailed from those places. We have lost a connection with our ancestors and a lot of those beliefs. When you first started kind of scratching the surface of this and digging deeper and deeper, did you find that you yourself could find a connection with these stories and these legends and things like that?
I feel like that's probably the most difficult part of the writing process, is trying to represent how someone would have felt visiting a holy well in the 6th century, because we've lost so much. Just as you're saying, we've lost that connection. And so that's always the area in my writing that has to become the most intuitive, because there's no other way to write those scenes. You have to just go still and go to some other place. Maybe that's where all that practice of, reading C.S. Lewis in the woods comes in handy. But so I think that's really, really difficult. And I don't know, because I feel like I'm always having to engineer it. It's nice to hear from readers that they are finding that connection. But for me, I feel like I'm too much the man behind the curtain to enjoy those moments, except for sometimes when I'm reading it back and I do feel transported to that place and that feeling, that thing that you can't quite explain that the character is experiencing. I do feel like when I read it back, it's almost as though I can't remember who wrote it. And that's really a magical thing. But that's the trickiest part. I hope these books help people find that connection. And that's why they're titled as they are. Languoreth was the lost queen. She was a historical queen in 6th century Scotland who was forgotten. And the Forgotten Kingdom is about the decline of the Britons in central Scotland. And, this kingdom of Gwenthilai and her brother Lailoken, how they were crushed by the other clans. And I'm trying to resurrect a lot with these books. So I think that idea of memory and connection is really important.
So how did you stumble on Languoreth and uncover this fascinating historical figure who is a historical figure, and she has this odd connection with a brother that most of us would be familiar with, at least the legends that have kind of sprung up around him. How did you discover this character?
It was after I'd written Fairy Tale, and I was in a little bookshop in Glastonbury, England, and I came across a title called Finding Merlin by an author named Adam Ardrey. And he's a Scot, and he's a lawyer who lives over near Glasgow. And he had become interested in researching his family ancestry. The name Ardrey led him to some really interesting conclusions about who the real Arthur might have been. And so he wrote a book called Finding Arthur, and this book I picked up was Finding Merlin, because one of the things he discovered in his research in Scotland was that there was this 6th century Queen Languoreth, who is mentioned in a hagiography of the local saint Kentigern. He's the patron saint of Glasgow. She's named as the wife of this historical king in this ancient text, and they say that she had this brother with whom she was very close, who was called Lailoken, and then Jocelyn of Furness, the monk who wrote the hagiography, adds, and he was also called by another name, and it was that of Myrthin, which is an older form of Merlin.
So as you start uncovering these characters, and then you realize that there are stories associated with these characters, and there are histories, and the farther we get away from an historical event or an historical character, the more muddy the waters get, and the more cloudy our memories become. And that's one of the great things about historical fiction, is that we get to isolate these characters and through good research, piece together their story. But then there are lots of holes in that story because things just get lost, and that's where a great historical fiction author comes in to tie together these things with believable story. How did you, when you discovered this character and became fascinated with her, how did you then start to do the research to uncover who she was, and how did you realize the places that you got to embellish some?
Well, there's two parts I think that I was battling with, and the first is this idea that I was a nonfiction writer at the time and had written a memoir, and memoir involves a little bit of fudging, because you have to go back and write a scene as though you were 8 or 9 or 10, and of course you're not walking around with a recorder in your pocket as a third grader. But so I had done some more fictional elements, but I wasn't really used to it. I think the biggest battle that I had was between the research, which was all very laid out. From Adam Ardrey's book, I actually went to Scotland and I met with him, and he took me around Glasgow to some of the sites that we visit, where some of the major events actually took place that I write about in The Lost Queen. Glasgow's necropolis was one, and so we have the events, we have the historical events, we have the locations. You can go visit those sites. Taking license with Languoreth's story was what I was most worried about, and because we don't know too much about her actual personality, except from looking at the events that she experienced and putting any human being in that place. What do you do when your brother goes to war against your own husband? You have to sort of put yourself in their shoes. But it was really difficult for me to feel like I could take that license with her. So for a long time, I was doing just the research. And I think I was just carrying her around with me. And I went to some of the sites. And it was almost as though by the time I had visited Dumbarton Rock, which is where she later ruled, I knew that she stood on these rocks where I was standing. And I would stand and look out on the same view that I knew she looked out on. And I just eventually came to have a feeling of her somehow that really was difficult to translate into words, except for when I would sit and plop her into these situations, and then the story would unfold, and I just had to trust that. But those two elements were really warring with me, and it is something I still think about as I move farther into this story, because great example is Angharad, her daughter. we only know her name. We don't know really anything about her except for that there was apparently a body of literature about her that's since been lost. So Angharad's story is one that I've had to completely manufacture. And I use it to show elements of the world, the 6th century world, that we wouldn't otherwise get to see. Like in the Forgotten Kingdom, we get to finally see the world of the Picts, who are such a fascinating people. But at the same time, I still am very conscious of not wanting to take too many liberties.
One thing that's very fascinating about this time is that we see this is kind of just post the merging of the cultures, where we get the ancient Celts and the Picts and these people, and then the influx of the Roman Empire and these kind of clash of cultures, and then what that clash of cultures means, for history, and what would go on to be a new society that comes up there. How fun was it getting to go to this time and look at what all had been and what was transforming and transpiring?
That's part of the work that I love the most. And I think what was really interesting about The Forgotten Kingdom was it turned into a much more interesting book than I had planned, because when I was in Scotland doing my research, I came across, I was in an area called Moffat, which is in the borders of Scotland and England. And there's folklore there that says that's where Lailoken went after this battle. He was in exile for 7 years. And when I went to visit that place, I was staying in these really funky wigwams owned by this history fanatic, John Hume, who was lovely. And he was really excited that I was there. We got to talking, and he told me that he thought that the 9th Legion of Rome disappeared in the Caledonian Wood, which used to cover that whole vast area of Scotland. And the Romans were petrified of the Caledonian Wood. They just thought that's where people go to die. If you go over the wall and you end up in the wood, you'll never be seen again. And they heard stories of ghosts and shades and all sorts of terrible. They had wolves and bears and everything horrible you could imagine if you're a civilized Roman soldier. But John Hume told me he thought that that's where the 9th Legion had been massacred. And there's a mystery about what happened to this very powerful legion, which you might have heard of. But writing that story it found its way into the novel. And we almost have a historical mystery on top of all of the other elements that are going on in the book. And that was really fun to write, because a lot of people think that Rome and the Roman invasion of England was out of the memory of the 6th century Britons and Scots and Picts, and I completely disagree. I mean, this was an oral tradition. We still talk about the Civil War, especially here where I live in the South, less so now, but you can still see the marks on the landscape of these engagements. We still talk about the Revolutionary War even today. And this was an oral tradition where they kept their stories so close, and they could name, 9 generations back of their ancestors over ale. So, no, I don't think that the Roman invasion was in any way a distant memory. I mean, that was something that really left a scar on the Celtic people. So it was really neat to be able to show the Roman invasion of the past and the mark that left on the psyche, and then also show and reflect it with the 6th century issues that the Celts were having with the Angles, who were invading and pushing their territory west and starting to push out the Celts who'd lived there for generations.
Signe, how do you feel when you've got this story that you uncovered and kind of becomes personal to you as you dig into it and you get immersed in this, and now to look back and to see comparisons that people are making and calling this book series like Outlander meets Camelot. How do you feel about that?
It's really strange, isn't it? I don't know. I mean, I guess I love Outlander. I never had much connection with the idea of Camelot because it never felt real to me. And I think it's because, as you said so well, Hank, when you look back, what the actual events become so muddied and so murky. And I think that what we were left with from the Arthurian saga was a bunch of sediment of nonsense on top of nonsense that was added for story effect and sometimes for political fancy and all of these things.
And it feels like fantasy, doesn't it?
It feels like fantasy, and there was never anything that I could connect to. And so, the Camelot description, and then of course Outlander. Wow, Diana Gabaldon is such a descriptive writer, and sometimes I will pick up her book and just say, how does she put us there? She's really somebody who puts you in the bodies of these characters walking around, because she's very tactile in her writing. But no, I mean, I think some people think it's true, and some people think it's much more in the realm of Philippa Gregory. And I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm happy that people are reading it, and that's really what matters.
So we're book 2 of the trilogies out there, Forgotten Kingdom. Where do we find the characters in this book? And at the end of this book, what is left for you to tell, and to where does the journey go from here that you're going to take us on?
So the Forgotten Kingdom opens in the aftermath of this big battle, which is what ended the book in The Lost Queen. And we start to follow these characters as they're scattered to the winds in the aftermath of this really bloody engagement that's happened, and how this battle, and each of them trying to find their own way home, transforms them as characters, is really a fascinating journey. And there's the pacing in this book was really exciting for me. So I felt as though it was really exciting to write from 3 perspectives rather than just one, because then I could show so much more of the early medieval period than I was able to in just Languoreth's point of view. And then toward the end of the book, things are really felt to me again as though they were just beginning, which is a really nice feeling. So much has happened in the course of the Forgotten Kingdom, but at the end of the book, there's also so much more still to come. Yet now there's all of these new alliances and new romances starting to take root and bud, and it's very exciting to be at that moment and know that what we're heading into is the Angle Wars, which took place in the 580s and into the 590s in Scotland. And it was a lot of battles that were pretty grisly. And I'm actually not a big battle person. I don't really I always find them kind of boring. I don't like watching war movies, but for some reason with these people, the Britons and the Scots and the Picts, I'm just there for it. I love it. So we'll have some good battles. There's a lot more to come. And a lot of actual historical events that I'm excited to be able to unveil for readers who aren't familiar with the time period.
I love it. Well, I can't wait to see where the story goes next. Signe, the series is amazing, and I'm recommending it to everyone. This is a great time to get in, where you can grab book 1. Book 2 is out right now, available everywhere that you buy books, either Kindle edition or hardcover or audiobooks. This is a fantastic audio series to get into as well if you like those. Signe, we put links to the books in the show notes of this episode to make it easy for people to find. Please tell people where they can find you online if they want to connect with you and dig into all the great stuff that you do.
Oh, sure. So my website is just signepike.com. And then I also do a lot of really fun stuff on social media, on my Facebook author page, and also mostly on Instagram. One of the neat things I did running up to publication of the second book in the series was I took readers on a virtual tour of all of the historical sites and my research journey behind the Forgotten Kingdom, we had a lot of fun with that. So I always share pictures from my research and books that I'm reading. And it's a really nice community that's grown up around those two places. That's a fun place to check out as well.
Absolutely. We will put links to your site and places where they can easily find you. Signe, this has been so much fun chatting. I love the new book. We're going to promote it everywhere and tell everybody about it. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Authors, I have a fantastic new service to tell you about. It's called PubSite. PubSite is a service to help you build your very own website, your home on the web, where you can promote your work and give your fans a place to connect with you. PubSite is a website platform that allows every author, regardless of budget, to have a great-looking professional website developed by the book marketing professionals at FSB Associates. PubSite is the new, easy-to-use DIY website builder developed specifically for books and authors. Whether you're an author of one book or 20, or a small publisher, PubSite allows you to build, design, and most importantly, update your website pain-free. No need to be dependent on a designer or webmaster to make a small but costly change to your website. Save the money and do it yourself. PubSite is the best platform for authors because it's a book-centric platform. PubSite was built just for authors and small publishers. Every design, feature, and layout is book-centric. They have customized designs for you to use. It's easy to build. No coding or HTML is necessary to create a stunning, professional-looking website with all the features you want. Get a custom domain name, yourname.com. It's simple to update. You can add all of your books, add a blog and a book tour, sell from any retailer, manage your email list and social media, and even do e-commerce. Build your website with a 14-day free trial, then pay just $19.99 per month, which includes hosting. And we offer packages starting at $499 to set up the website for you. Pub-site.com, the place to help authors find their home on the web.